Hello there. You are listening to KPCALP Petaluma 103.3 FM. You are here on State of the Union with DG the 30-something. Thank you for joining me tonight. I want to start, as I always do, by talking a little bit about this agency and why it's so important. So Petaluma Community Access has been a long-standing organization in Petaluma. Sorry, there was some background music, although maybe it'll be a little nice for some background music while I'm talking. So Petaluma Community Access has been a staple in the community for many, many years. And we started with a TV station, which we still have. And we still have members producing content there. TV stations, I should say. And now we have this radio, and we are a community-based organization, so we are always looking for support. So if you would like to help out the agency, we really do rely on donations and support and membership and all that good stuff. So please contact me, contact the agency if you'd like to get involved, as I always say. And I think it's especially relevant to my shows, or evident in my show, but relevant to all the shows, that I really do believe that community radio helps allow for democracy to continue to exist in this country. And I say that because by providing a local voice, whatever that may look like, whether it's through music or whether it's through talk, or whatever that looks like, getting this local opportunity to see how people express themselves locally really kind of elevates the community-based voice instead of a larger media narrative. So again, please contact me, contact the agency. We are member-based. The member rates are very reasonable, and you just need to be a Petaluma resident or work in Petaluma, and you can be a part of this. So join, please, like I said. So the topics discussed in today's show do not represent the opinions of PCA, its members, its board members, its staff, or anything of the like. You never know if it actually represents my opinion either. Sometimes I like to just present an alternative opinion. But let's get started. I am going to talk about minimum wage increases. So, and the reason I was prompted to do this show, because I believe it had to be last week, I think. The Petaluma City Council decided to really, for all intents and purposes, fast forward the California state decision to increase the minimum wage by 2023. So the city of Petaluma decided in 2020, as of 2020, that companies 25 and less were going to be increasing the minimum wage to $14, up from the California state minimum wage of $11, and that the companies that are 26 employees or more were going to go directly to the 15 from the California state level, which is currently $12 an hour. And then those companies that are less than 25 or less are going to have the gradual increase the following year to match up. So that is a $3 an hour increase as of January of 2020. So, and so the California state minimum wage, it's going up annually, and it's progressive. And so the smaller companies, I think it is 25 and less, same scheme, they started at a lower rate of increase, but everyone's going to be at $15 an hour in 2023. And companies 26 or larger are going to be there in 2022. And this law was passed quite a while ago. I think the wages have been incrementally increasing for, what was it, since 2017. So it was prior to 2017. So they've been going up $1 each year. But there was some delays, and there were some things that did occur because it was supposed to already be implemented by now. But anyway, so as of right now, the state minimum wage will be $15 an hour across the board in 2023. As of 2021, in the city of Petaluma, minimum wages across the board will be $15 an hour. And come next year, they will be going up by $3 an hour for the different size agencies. So let's talk about the arguments for an increased minimum wage. So I actually wanted to look up actual documented arguments for an increase in minimum wage. Like, obviously, I know how I justify minimum wage increases, but I wanted to kind of present how it's generally thought about. So some of those are that it is a fair wage distribution. It causes a fair wage distribution. That it levels wages with the rate of inflation. So the idea is that minimum wage hasn't increased at the same rate that inflation. I mean, it kind of is economic inflammation, but it's inflation, not inflammation. So trying to level out those two things where the minimum wage increases are better in line with the inflation increases. The idea that it is going to decrease the need for public support for low-wage communities, and that it's going to decrease poverty, and that it's going to increase the purchasing power of workers, and that, this was an interesting, well, businesses can afford it. So that was an interesting kind of perspective that was there. I don't know. I actually didn't really have time before the show to try to do in-depth research of what the city council's rationale was. I knew it was coming. I think people that are involved have known it was coming prior to the election because it was something that was talked about during the debates. But I didn't have a time to do a deep dive into what the individual council members thought about the minimum wage increase and what their rationale was behind it, because what was reported in the media just was kind of this general economic stimulation kind of rationale. But I would assume that a lot of these arguments for why we increased the minimum wage were relevant in the community, because it has changed quite a bit. I've been living in Petaluma off and on for over 25 years. So there's been a lot of changes. And so I think that that's something that people were really lobbying for, was for a local increase before the state did it. So that is what happened last week, and we shall see in 2020. So let's get into the economics of the situation. So as I think, I don't want to say it's well known, but I think that it's kind of understood that the economics about it is, they argue. Economists argue. And I find it really interesting because when you read more popular articles that even refer to academic research, they distinguish between liberal economics and conservative economics. And so I'm going to get to that later. But the research is inconclusive. And I think the reason that the research is inconclusive is because we don't know yet. The minimum wage has been going up since 1938, when it was created, when the bill was signed by Roosevelt after the Depression. And so it's been gradually going up, but not at an exponential rate. So I think that the major reason that it's really being looked into now is because it's going up very significantly, especially in Washington, California, some of the states that have really kind of put the increases into high gear, set them into high gear. But the reality is we're not going to know for another 10 years, maybe, what the true implications are. Economists do predict that economic flows happen in 10-year increments. So if we're hitting a $15, I think $1 increase every year is quite significant. So perhaps we'll start seeing in 10 years from the start in 2017 some of the implications of that increase, and then they will change. But until that happens, we don't really know. However, there is research that has looked into it. And this show, I usually go into some pretty significant academic research. I didn't for this reason because I think when it comes to economics, it's not what people are looking at. They're not looking at economic science. They're looking at the popular opinion. And so I did kind of pull out some of the studies that have been done, and really there's been studies done, of course, in California and Seattle, were two of the main, like Washington, Oregon, and California are the three that are really being researched right now because of their huge shifts in minimum wage. And really, what I thought was interesting is that only one set of research that I saw that was current, that was based on the current increases, was that there was no change in employment, but again, it was only looking at kind of a 3-year period. So it was basically saying that incomes increased, employment didn't change. But some other interesting factors, a lot of the other research did show by extrapolating the data that there was going to be a decrease in employment or a decrease in employee hours over time for businesses. And I think that this whole argument that businesses can afford it has to do with the idea of large business, not small business, because we kind of have this rhetoric in our country that is anti-corporation, but people aren't able to articulate that they're talking about large corporations that manipulate the system, not a small corporation necessarily. And so we kind of have that messaging going around when it comes to these issues that the corporation's bad, and so we need to do anything to make them be better. And yeah, these minimum wage increases are not going to affect really large companies. I mean, they're going to, the large companies, so really in short, it may not actually, in actuality, affect the large companies, but they're going to come out. Historically, we've seen, if you go through the history of when these things occurred, they will come out and still say they had to do layoffs because of the wage increases. And again, so I'm going to get more into that later, but UCLA students looked at restaurants. So again, I think that in general, people are looking at a kind of a gross effect over all industries. But what's really important is the effect on low-skilled industries. And the data found that when you actually did extrapolate out for low-skilled industries, which are lower-paid industries, that there were changes in employment rates. And there was actually a really interesting phenomenon. There's a couple. So actually purchasing power. So one of the arguments is that it's going to increase purchasing power of people, which at face, yeah, they're making more money. They're going to spend more money. And what was really interesting is some of the research that came out of UCLA actually showed that purchasing power varied based on area, which there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, there's obviously variances in standard of living, which means that solely an increase in income isn't going to actually increase your purchasing power. It might just kind of level it out. And so I found that to be really interesting. They actually looked at, I think it was like police officers or, it was one of the, I think it was police officers and firefighters or police officers. And it showed based on different counties that they had different purchasing power. And actually what I thought was remarkable, that actually in some counties the purchasing power seemed to be relatively stable while the income wasn't. So that's actually what the interesting part is that, just because you have a higher income doesn't mean that your purchasing power is greater. That's what that research showed. So I think that that's an important consideration over time, because it is this idea that place matters, and the increase isn't necessarily increasing your purchasing power relative to the area. And so again, the effect is not equally distributed. Things are very different. So when it comes to GDP, which I'm not 100% reliant on the GDP as being a huge indicator of everything, because I think there's so many aspects that go into the gross domestic product. So it's a measure of our total national productivity that's occurring. So the research that I looked at, and it's come out of the Employment Policy Institute, which is a nonprofit that found money to fund an economist to actually do this research, is that there was no positive effect on the GDP. So, and then there was this idea that it can actually hurt low-skilled worker industries. And then there is, so one of the major arguments is that it may negatively affect employment rates, and it's different in every area, whether it does or it doesn't. The research I saw did show that there were predicted effects in California, and again, I think that probably has a lot to do with actual cost of running business in California relative to other states, and the mandates for healthcare provision and all that kind of stuff. So I do think that is a consideration. And again, looking at not the gross effect across all industries and all company sizes, but starting to look at specifically what is happening. And one of the studies actually looks specifically at the restaurant industry, which is a major sector of employment in the state of California. And there were predicted decreases in employment. So increase in revenue, but decrease in employment. And included in the decrease in employment is decrease in hours. So not just this really dramatic, like they're going to be firing people, but they might be decreasing hours, which, then the question is like, well, how do they accommodate? Well, maybe the owner, I always think in the scope of small business. I don't think in the scope of large business. I think in the scope of small business. So, well, maybe the owner has to work more, or, they have to lessen their hours, or they have to lower their staff. They have to, that's on any given shift. Anyway, I don't know. I don't have that kind of company, so I don't know how that's accommodated for. But so that's kind of some of the economics. Again, I didn't want to make it like this heavy kind of academic economic discussion. But what I do want to introduce is a basic economic theory. Many people don't agree with it, but it is what economic science has showed us over the life of economic science. That increases in wages increases demand for goods and services, which decreases supply, which increases price. That's a simple supply and demand equation. So when there's a decreased supply, there's going to be an increase in price of that good or service. So let's talk about what isn't addressed by minimum wage increases. So we kind of talked about what is addressed. Let's talk about what isn't addressed by minimum wage increases. So it does not address housing. And again, I'm trying to make this, so let me give the scope. I started by saying it was based on the city of Petaluma's decision. So I am doing this pretty much under the scope of Petaluma, Sonoma County. I think it can be applied broader, but that's kind of my main focus tonight, is specifically on Petaluma, Sonoma County, kind of. But I do almost feel like Petaluma is its own county a lot of the time, because it's very different. Anyway, so it does not address housing. And so I think that if you live in California, if you live in Sonoma County, if you live in Petaluma, if you know anyone that lives in California or Northern California, you know that housing is a major issue. There is a major housing supply shortage, and because of that, the housing costs are very high. It was already an issue prior, and actually it was an issue prior solely based on demand. So there was a really high demand for housing because there was a lot of influx of people moving into the area for various reasons. And there was a low supply of housing that was available, especially in Petaluma. Especially, rental housing. It's a tough thing. And then if you know anyone that's been trying to buy houses, a lot of our houses are really at inflated rates due to people coming in and buying housing and for cash, for example, that are from other areas and are making incomes that we certainly do not make in Sonoma County. So there's been significant jumps in housing costs. And then after the fires, the supply and demand issue got worse. So there is a very, the supply was lessened very significantly in Santa Rosa, as well as other areas in unincorporated Sonoma County, primarily, that caused a huge issue because Santa Rosa is traditionally less expensive than living in Petaluma. And so that posed an issue, but it also posed an issue. The major issue is that it greatly decreased the supply of housing for the people that were here. So that was an issue. I could not find, so of course, I did this whole show that included housing in Sonoma County, and there was some data about the housing cost increases versus the wage increases. I could not find my notes, didn't have time to watch the video, and could not find it online, even though I know one of the Board of Supervisors members shared it. But don't quote me on this, but I think, if I remember correctly, the statistic is that, and I think it was from 2010, I want to say, somewhere around there, that the cost of housing has increased by 38%, but the wages are only up 6%. It's relatively close to that, if that is not the stat. So again, the idea is that by increasing the minimum wage, that the wages will then go up, but by 32% to reach the housing market, not so much. So the next thing that increasing minimum wage does not address is healthcare or health. So one major thing, and this is actually talked about, I had no idea, I just thought, this is something that I thought about, but in doing my research, that this is something that's really talked about quite significantly among those who are really looking at the implications of minimum wage increase, and it's the access to social services, specifically medical insurance, because most of our social services are assessed based on the federal poverty level. Now, California has made accommodation to offer services for higher levels of the poverty level than perhaps other states, and I would think that that's in recognition that the cost of living here is much higher than it is in other states, and so the national federal poverty level is $12,140 for an individual. I think it's been steadily going down for the last 5 or 6 years. The poverty level has been going down, which is interesting. And the poverty level for a family of 4 is $25,000 a year, federally. And so Medi-Cal, again, there's more to it, but in general, Medi-Cal qualification is 138% of federal poverty level. But again, there's tons of other considerations. It's your children's ages, if you're disabled, if you're elderly, then there's Medicare, there's Medi-Cal. There's a lot of considerations, but just for me, working young adult I don't know if I'm a young adult anymore, but anyway. So for me to get Medi-Cal, I would need to be making about 138% of the federal poverty level. And again, I know there's some accommodation, but the Affordable Care Act kind of changed the structure of the programming since then. So, so just for reference, the $11 an hour, which is the current minimum wage rate in the state of California, it equals $22,880 a year. It's like the gross. And that's assuming you work full time. I just did a 40-hour a week job at 52 weeks a year calculation. Simple annual wage calculation. And then $15 an hour puts you at $31,200 a year. So at neither of those wages based on the 138% if you are an individual without some of these other considerations. So you already wouldn't qualify for Medi-Cal. But what has changed with the structure with the Affordable Care Act is that many people are on a sliding scale. And so the Affordable Care Act affects individuals as well as qualifying businesses that qualify for a subsidy for health insurance. I think it's still true in the state of California that if you are 10 people or less, you don't have to provide medical care to your employees. But I know that companies are really trying to make a shift. I can't remember if it's 10 or... Anyway, I should look this up. Things change quite often, but it's somewhere around there. But I know that a lot of companies, are trying to make the most valiant effort to provide medical insurance for their employees because healthy employees increases productivity. And so that's what everyone wants to see, but it is a huge monetary consideration for any agency or company to provide medical insurance. So I got on that tangent because the Affordable Care Act actually subsidizes both individual and business insurance rates. And it's on sliding scale. So it's income based. And I think a lot of people understand this because a lot of people that do not have employer paid medical are utilizing the Affordable Care Act as their source of medical. And so with an increase in income, there is going to be an increase in your monthly medical cost. And there really is no prediction whether or not there'll be effect on companies providing medical to employees if they have to increase their wages, but that is a major consideration, and I think that it's kind of glossed over, and it's not just ACA. If you go to a lot of health centers, they run on sliding scale. So even if you don't have, obviously they're really encouraging everyone to have medical insurance, but it's also can be too expensive based on people's income still to have medical insurance. So based on real income. So the clinics function on a sliding scale too. And so if your income goes up, then your classification in that sliding scale is going to go up. I mean, that's just how it works. So with an increase of $4 an hour, the medical costs are going to increase for these employees if they have health insurance, if they are utilizing the Affordable Care Act, or if they are utilizing a clinic without health insurance that's on a sliding scale. So it is a consideration. And then the other thing that the other thing I want to point out, actually, because there's a lot of shoulds. There's a lot of, you should be able to make this kind of money in this area doing certain things. You should be living in a dual income household. You should and or most people, and it's just not reality. The assumption in a lot of those arguments is that people are living in a dual income household, but with the cost of childcare alone, a lot of families aren't in a dual income household solely based on the fact that it's cheaper for one of the parents to stay home than it is for them to work. And so that's another consideration. And all these calculations of rates is that the federal poverty rates are based on household. They're not based on, it's not $25,000 for every one of the 4 people living in your household. That's $25,000, or everyone working, that's $25,000 for the household. So that's a major consideration, is this assumption that we live in a society where both parents are working, which is true. I mean, I think that that's a true statement. But again, just taking that into consideration, that what should be happening may not be what should be happening, may not be what is happening, or what people want to happen. So, also not considered in minimum wage increases is education. So education has direct correlations. Educational attainment, so that's graduating high school, is usually the base level of educational attainment that we look at in communities. And then we look at, college graduation rates and higher levels of education, professional education. And so there are direct correlations with higher education and income. Intuitive, I would think, is relatively intuitive. There is an increased, what I think is really strong, and I am a huge advocate for this, is the increase in vocational training. So I think one of the things, and it was very well known prior to the fires, but I think one of the major things the fires brought out about the local area is that there weren't enough construction workers and electricians and plumbers, and a lot of this very vocational based work couldn't be fulfilled because there weren't people that were trained to do it. I have friends that are contractors. They say, well, we can't find enough employees that are willing to do it, even though, the salaries are relatively high. And so I think that that's a major thing. So offering this vocational training, getting people part of the unions that are very much represented in these fields, in order to deploy them to do this work, I think is really important. And so I do appreciate there is kind of a major push locally. I mean, I know all over, but there's a major push locally to kind of emphasize and encourage this vocational training, because there is a lot of money to be made. That is a big consideration. So the other aspect of education I want to talk about is student loan debt. So student loan debt I've done a whole show on this. It is a huge debilitating factor to a very large up-and-coming population in the United States. It is actually starting to become the generations that are taking over what would be considered the major spending capacity in the country. So the demographics that should be spending the most money, the drivers of the economies, are over time now becoming those who have the highest levels of student loan debt, which on top of regular debt that, was seen. But I think, separating out student loan debt, this, my generation being really the first major one, that it's a pretty systematic issue. And then it's the generations following. A lot of will have the same issue, at least the generation following. So student loan debt really decreases your purchasing power. So since we're kind of looking at this from an economic lens, it is an additional debt payment that takes money out of the economy and puts it directly to the debtor. And just like the Affordable Care Act rates for health insurance, if you're on an income contingent student loan debt payment like I am, your payment goes up when you make more money. And for some of these people, when it increases, they may be at a zero payment because it's discretionary income is the measure of how much you pay, and there's certain limitations, but that is something to be considered. And if we want populations to be actually enabled to pay off their student loans, or if we just want it to be able to be financed at zero, and that's kind of for 25 years and wait it out, and so these are huge considerations. Buying a house on top of student loan debt really compounds the issue. And then also even just accessing education, understanding, that this is a huge consideration, I think is a big deal. So let's move on. I'm kind of glossing over this because I've done other shows about these topics. I talk about them a lot. So I kind of want to get to the end part, and I already only have 20 minutes left. So the other thing that isn't assessed or isn't addressed by a minimum wage increase is community, the sense of community. So I am about to get in some loaded topics, but I think it's incredibly important, and I think it's something that I will, above all else, call out the Petaluma community, government, the strongest with these issues over anything else I've mentioned today. Regardless of if I agree with minimum wage increases or not, these are the issues that I think that have not been addressed during any of my time by leadership effectively in Petaluma. And let's talk about institutional racism and segregation. So, institutional racism is not as we think of it as cultural racism. So, institutional racism is the idea, well, it's not the idea, it's the history that laws were passed in order to create, affirm, and maintain racism within our country. And so there's a lot of institutional racism that has occurred. I was in a session today that reminded me of the institutional racism that caused this segregation of communities based on how mortgages were distributed in the country. So kind of part of this idea that place matters is a construct because certain people weren't allowed to buy houses, period. And then some people couldn't buy houses in certain communities based on the manipulation of how mortgages were given. And, part of it was fear-mongering that getting white people out of houses if people of color started moving into the neighborhood because it was going to decrease their property value. So, again, institutional racism is laws that are put into place in order to keep people at a disadvantage based on their race solely. I think that I bring this up as such a major concern. It's obviously a major concern federally. It's an issue. It's been an issue since our country started, and it's not looked at in an adequate manner because we always individualize racism. Especially in California, we try to say, well, I'm not racist, so it doesn't matter. Like, that person's racist in Texas, but I'm not racist. But we don't actually address any institutional racism, which has created these inequalities in our country since its start. As a government, I'm not talking about the land mass that was here and the people that lived here before, but as a government since its start. And so I don't think the city has adequately looked at, addressed, spoken to, reached what I would call the segregated populations and the census tracts of lower income, which tend to be people of color, even within our own city, even though this is a white city, there are areas that have very low income populations that are primarily people of color. And this city, I feel like, has never adequately addressed or even talked to the people in those communities. This is why I'm very, very against districting in the city of Petaluma, because I think it's going to really create a gerrymandering situation within our city. And I know I have a lot of people that I'm friends with that would disagree with me, but I'm very much against that because the implications are what we call gerrymandering, and it's going to really affect how the decision-making process is done. But really, I think it's this lack of recognition of these kind of subcultures that we have and the sub-economic cultures that we have and people that aren't being reached. And there's this constant kind of like, oh, we need to reach more people, but you don't even know how to have a conversation. So how do you start? Because there's not adequate representation in the city. There, in my opinion, never has been. So until you have better representation, it's going to really not make it welcoming to young people, people of color, people who English is their second language, people who are just moving here. We have this very kind of isolationist idealism, I think, in Petaluma, where there's been a predominant opinion in power that nothing's gonna ever change, and we want to keep the character of Petaluma as it is, but that doesn't actually address. I mean, I would actually argue, and I'm not saying this to mass generalize because I'm not saying that this is what people are actually thinking when they say that, but I would argue that in general, if I heard that, I would automatically assume that there was an isolationist, we don't want to change and address the issues that have always been here and that have never been addressed, because we don't want our world to change as we know it. So anyway, that is, I mean, institutional racism is obviously a huge topic, but I don't think that we talk about race in this city in any sort of an effective manner, because we are not inclusive in that arena. You know, the West Side is very well represented in leadership. And, you know, I live on the West Side, but I grew up on the East Side. And, you know, I just, anyway, I could go on for days. But income inequality. So minimum wage increases don't actually effectively respond to income inequality. The idea is that it is making incomes more equitable, but the differences in income that we have are so significant in this country that it's not really addressing this income inequality that is present. And again, I think that's addressed in many of the other areas that are not addressed, that I discussed earlier. It also, so kind of tandem to the institutional racism idea, it does not actually address equitable opportunity. So increasing wages across the board at a base level doesn't actually address the idea of providing people with an equitable opportunity to advance themselves. And I will do, as I have done many a time, is define equality versus equity. Because we've kind of, it's interesting because we see this huge shift culturally in these conversations about everything being talked about as equity and not equality. But then very often the two are not defined, they're not distinguished in definition because they're not interchangeable. So just because equity is the buzzword doesn't mean that it can just replace equality. They actually mean two different things. So equality is providing everyone with the same tools to be successful. Equity is providing people with the tools that they need given their circumstance to be successful. Therefore, it isn't necessarily the same tools as the person next to them or their neighbor. That's the difference between equality and equity. And we've been fighting for equality for many years, and the lens changed because equality actually kind of created this idea of color blindness, and that, well, this is the land of opportunity and everyone has the same tools in front of them in order to be successful. But because of the system that we've set up, innately, people do not need the same tools. They need the different tools to be successful. And so those are the major differences. And I always need to make that distinction, because I really don't like when I get the feeling that those words are being used interchangeably, because it causes this huge misunderstanding of what the two ideas are. So I'm trying to move away from the idea of equality because it doesn't work based on the system that we have created at this point in time. We need to create equity where people have equal opportunity, but equal opportunity involves the tools necessary in order to have the same opportunity as the next person. I know that might sound confusing, but that is kind of the thing. So we want equitable opportunity so that people are given the tools they need to succeed within this country. Because it is the land of opportunity, but we've been sold this whole idea of the melting pot and living the American dream and all these things, which actually reinforced this institutional racism and inequality that was created, again, like, you know, during the huge immigrant influxes in the country way back when. So, and then, you know, one of my main questions is, does it really address social justice? You know, social justice talks about an equal distribution of resources, whether it's wealth, yada, 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 in order to elevate communities. And so, and again, arguably, the definition of social justice actually doesn't lead to equity, because it's an equal distribution instead of, I mean, I guess the total end game, right, would be a total socially justice-minded community where there's an equal distribution of everything. But at face, I actually, and I read the definition today because I know what social justice means in my mind, but I wanted to read it. I like doing that from time to time, just read the definition and say, So, again, does this really address equity? I don't know. You know, like fighting for social justice. I mean, I want to fight for social equity. That's kind of health equity. I would say health equity, social equity, you know, economic equity, judicial equity. So I think that that's kind of how I distinguish. And you know, I constantly get in these situations where people are like, oh, tomato, tomato. It's like, no, our words matter a lot. What we say matters a lot. You know, those things can't be just, you know, glossed over. All right, so closing. Got like, 6 minutes? 7 minutes? So really what, again, so I meant to bring this up earlier, is that capitalism is also manipulated. So that's why I think that the economics is hard to assess, because supply and demand for specific goods can actually be manipulated. Like we see it with fuel costs, and we see it with implication of tariffs in general, and all these kind of things. So it's kind of a manipulation of what would be the normal economic ebb and flow. That being said, in the capitalistic society, even given those things, it still has the same economic flow. However, if we come in and say fuel is going to be at $3.50 a gallon on this corner in this city, all the gas stations charge relatively the same price because there's kind of this mutual economic agreement that if one does one, whatever, so you sell yourself in a different manner. It's actually something that actually explains that. I don't remember. I learned about that a long time ago in economics, but so capitalism is very much manipulated. So that's a huge consideration too. And often, you know, what I kind of saw over and over when I was doing research is that we forget that a lot of these decisions are strictly political. Now, I'm not saying that the individual's intentions aren't good, but they're doing it as a political interest to push their agenda, which to me implies solely they haven't actually considered all the implications of their decision. So it's not just minimum wage increase, it's that, well, I'm going to do this because it's good for my political career, but I actually haven't considered what the long-term implications or the short-term implications are of this decision. And I think that, that's a major issue. And I talk about this quite a bit in all different levels of policy, because we kind of do these one-off siloed policies where we say, well, this is going to make my constituents feel better. But then there's not this holistic kind of, well, wait a minute, how do we actually address this issue of racism, income inequality, lack of housing, lack of access to healthcare, and decreased health? How do we, in a holistically manner, look at these issues and actually make my constituency healthier, not just make them happy in that short term? And it's not easy. These things aren't easy, but I wish someday politicians and policymakers will actually start to consider, wait a minute, what is this siloed decision going to make that I'm making that I promised I would do when I was running for re-election actually imply for the long-term health of my constituency? What a novel idea. Crazy, right? Actually thinking about the people you work for and what's going to make them be well, not just make them happy in that moment. So, I would like to see, I think one of the major things right now is that communities that are forward-thinking are preparing for the next crash. Communities and governments, because it is forecasted within the next couple of years, especially locally, given the impact of the fires. And I think that that's something that really needs to be considered, not just the short-term solutions, but how do we really create a safety net around our communities during the next crash so that there isn't this major turmoil that can't be addressed among business, individuals, the housing market, all those kind of things. And I think the crash is going to look different, but it is. A lot of communities are preparing for the crash, so I would like my local community, as dismal and depressing as that sounds, I think that, I'm an economic doomsday prepper. I'm already preparing for the next crash because I am a small business owner, and these things greatly affect elections greatly affect the success of my business because I work in nonprofit and government. So a crash is really going to affect the success for me as a business owner. And really, it's always this question, is something better than nothing? Is it? Is just something better than nothing? And finally, I think that kind of going back to representing your constituency is that the loudest voices are not the only voices. So I am going to leave everyone with that. You, again, are listening to State of the Union with DG the 30-something. You can catch me here in 2 weeks from today. Again, I am always looking for topics. I am always looking for people, so please contact me if you would like to be on my show. You can send questions over to domayne@maberme.com. And if you're watching on Facebook, you know how to ask questions. Thank you again so much for joining me. You are listening to KPCALP Petaluma 103.3. Thanks.